Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. We have a bunch of new games to talk about this week, oddly enough, and in order to do so, I'm actually going to have two different guests joining me throughout this show to give their thoughts on titles that are just now arriving on Switch. For this first segment and to deliver his review of one of the more unexpected announcements from this past summer, LEGO Horizon Adventures, it's GameSpot's Mark Delaney. Mark, how are you?
Doing well, Brian. Thanks for having me back. We did your Patreon exclusive show before. Now it's nice to be on the main show.
Yeah, so All Things Gamers, you appeared over there. What game were you reviewing that time?
Oh man, was it Silent Hill 2 maybe?
No, it was for that, but
why can't I remember? I know we spoke of NBA as well, but that wasn't the focus either.
It's all right. People can go back and listen to it. Yeah, it's All Things Gamers on the Patreon, which we will talk about a little bit later as well. But as you mentioned, this is your first appearance on All Things Nintendo, so welcome.
Thank you.
Also, as we had with All Things Gamers, we have a different tradition here when people make their debut, and that is answering two very simple but sometimes very difficult questions. It is first Nintendo game and favorite Nintendo game. So that first part is, what is your first Nintendo game, first Nintendo memory, first Nintendo console? However you want to interpret that question.
So it's weird being on this very Nintendo focused show because I kind of grew up with Sega and then PlayStation. I think I really got into Nintendo around the 64 era, but I did play, NES and things before that. So I guess my first memory with like that platform with the brand is actually going over to my friend's house after school in probably like first, second, third, fourth, somewhere in that like elementary school age. I'd go a couple houses down. This kid Matt, I forget his last name. I was trying to remember. I can't remember. Matt, if you're listening, I still remember these days. I would go over to his house and we actually played Zombies Ate My Neighbors. I think that was probably my first Nintendo game.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think probably even then, at much too young of an age, I already liked horror stuff. So I was totally into that game. I've remembered it fondly for years since then. I haven't played it a lot since those days, actually. But I always think back on it like, yeah, that game was rad.
Yeah, that was one of those games that I always saw at like KB Toys when I would go to the mall and I'd be like, oh, what's this? Zombie Ate My Neighbors. What does that even mean? And then like I'd play a little bit of it and I'd be like, yeah, I don't need to buy this. Like it's fun to play for like 5 minutes at the mall, but I don't need to buy it. I think that was a game that I think I remember playing the first time I ever came to Minneapolis when I was a little kid, and I came to the Mall of America. Now I live in Minneapolis, but my dad previously worked in Minneapolis, so I would go visit him every once in a while. And going to the Mall of America for the first time, and I think they had a Zombies Ate My Neighbors like setup there, which is weird because that would be pretty late in the life cycle.
Yeah. It's got kind of a cult following. I think they re-released it a couple years ago, and I feel awkward coming onto the Nintendo show and not shouting out like Zelda or Mario or something. But
that's the more interesting answer.
Yeah, that was definitely, it must have been my first one because I was playing Madden and Mortal Kombat and Sonic at that age, and then over at Matt's house I'd get to play Zombies Ate My Neighbors.
Wow, that's an interesting first pick or first experience with Nintendo. So that brings us to the next part, which is, what is your favorite Nintendo game?
This one might be even weirder because now you're giving me all of the brand's history and I'm still not going Zelda or Mario or one of those. My favorite has got to be WWF No Mercy.
Oh wow, N64.
It was man, my cousins and I put so many hours into this game. And even more than probably we intended, because I learned later, it says this on the Wikipedia page, I learned this many years later, that some copies of this game were like corrupted in such a way that it would just, every once in a while, just delete all of your save data and just totally wipe everything. And we'd do like goofy backyard wrestling, and we'd have our characters and we'd come out as different people over the course of a couple hours, just hanging out, throwing each other through tables in the backyard and stuff. But and then we'd go make those guys in No Mercy. And then, about once a month or so, they would just be wiped from the game entirely. We have to make them again. But we always did. We loved that game. I think if you ask, wrestling and wrestling game fans, a lot of them will still tell you, like, pound for pound, No Mercy is the best it's ever been. And it'd be tough to play today, besides like the nostalgia, but it was so good in its day.
I was always a WCW versus NWO Revenge.
Oh yeah, same
That was
developer, I think. Yeah.
a wrestling game. I have not been into wrestling, like pro wrestling, in since middle school, so probably like 25 years.
Hmm.
And I was much more into WCW because that's at that time that was where all of the big names were, right? Like a
Hmm.
lot of the big names had left the
Yeah, they had
WWF.
poached them.
Yeah, and they went to the WCW, and I loved the fact that like they had all these huge names on the roster, and I liked the gameplay a little bit better in WCW versus NWO Revenge. But yeah, all my friends were like big No Mercy fans, and they were all about that. So I have no problem with that being, but like it is an interesting pick for favorite Nintendo game of all time.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it might seem like a weird one. I was like, I don't know if he's heard this one before, so I didn't want to give you the heads up that I was going to pick a weird one.
So before we jump into the news, now is as good a time as any to remind you that you can support all things Nintendo through several different methods. The best way is through the Patreon page, which offers bonuses like early and ad-free episodes, access to the community Discord, priority for Q&A episodes, and if you come in at the $10 level, you get an entire second weekly podcast called All Things Gamers. Other ways to support the show include the merch shop on tpublic.com and my YouTube channel, which you can find at Brian P. Shea. Speaking of all things gamers, Mark, I looked it up while you were telling me about Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and it was the casting of Frank Stone.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, we
So,
talked Astrobot and the casting of Frank Stone when you were on that
yeah, yeah.
episode.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and then a little NBA at the end where we're kind of lamenting the pay to win aspects, yeah.
Exactly. So, Mark, jumping into the news here, believe it or not, we got a Nintendo Direct this week.
Hmm.
So, I feel like in 2024, though, Nintendo has really started throwing that term around, especially considering how we are all anxiously awaiting news about Switch 2 at this point. But that's not what this is. This was I think it was around the time of like the Mario movie that they started just calling every like presentation a direct.
Hmm.
They're like, okay, yeah, this is the Super Mario Brothers movie direct, and this is the Super Nintendo World Direct. This was the Super Nintendo World Direct, I guess two, because it was talking about Donkey Kong Country, which is
Hmm.
the new section of Super Nintendo World. And the tour took place at Universal Studios Japan, located in Osaka, which I did go to when when it was only Super Nintendo World Open. I guess that
Nice.
was 2 years ago now,
Hmm.
three
Yeah,
years.
roughly, yeah.
2 years ago is when I went for we were out there for our Street Fighter 6 cover story in Osaka, and I looked over at Alex Van Aken, who was our video guy at the time, and I go, hey man, like we should go to Super Nintendo World, and he was like, I am so down. So we spent an entire day out. A little difficult to get back from. We had to use Google Translate on a cab driver.
Oh yeah, I was recently in Thailand for work, and I was similarly like a little bit lost and not knowing how to convert my money and things like that. It was an adventure.
Yeah, Japan I feel is pretty tourist friendly. I've never been to Thailand, but like I just basically treat like the 7-Eleven like the U.S. Embassy in Japan. But yeah, most places in Tokyo, especially, and much of Osaka, they are pretty open to English speakers,
Hmm.
and they're able to at least like understand when you ask for like English menu, and they'll bring you like an English menu. I found, and then like the train systems are just second to none. I don't know
I
how it
always
is in
hear
Thailand.
about them. Yeah.
Yeah, but go to Tokyo if you can, and Osaka, which is where Super Nintendo World with Donkey Kong Country is going to be. And as the tradition has pretty much been established, this tour was given by Shigeru Miyamoto, and you can enter Donkey Kong Country through this tunnel that is on the far side of the Mario section. And you could definitely tell that there was something going to be there
Hmm.
when we went back fairly like fairly close to its opening, like because you would go and there would be like you walk out into Princess Peach's castle. That's how you enter Super Nintendo World, exit there, and then like there's like this big like area that kind of goes down, and you can go downstairs or you can go up and go to like the Mario Kart ride and everything. But once you go down, there's like if you go over to the right, there is like a shop with a bunch of merchandise and everything. And then if you keep going that direction, there's just kind of like a dead end. And it was like, okay, well, they're probably going to be adding something here, but like we had no idea what at that point. Um, so that dead end has now become the entrance to Donkey Kong Country. So you walk through it, and like it's like kind of like the bricks, like the Mario bricks, and then those bricks suddenly turn into like kind of like cave rocks
Hmm.
all around. So you're walking through a cave almost, and then you emerge, and there's the view of the Golden Temple straight ahead. There's Donkey Kong's treehouse pretty close to the entrance. There's a Donkey Konga mini game where you can hit bongos, and if you hit them like in the rhythm to like the beat that they're playing, you make Rambi the rhinoceros appear. And then there's an activity where you go around collecting the KONG letters, like in the game.
Hmm.
And you have to use the power up bands for that. I do have a couple of power up bands. I don't have the Donkey Kong ones, obviously, which were just announced. But I've gone to both the open, and all my stuff is falling as I grab this. But I do have a Mario and Yoshi power up band, which I'm showing on the video version right now. And they just announced that there are two new ones. One is Donkey Kong, and the other one is Diddy Kong. And for some reason, Diddy Kong is DD, which I guess is like kind of like the sound. It's because like Donkey Kong, it says DK on it, right?
Right.
Like the
Yeah.
little like instead of like the Yoshi egg that people in the video version are seeing right now, it is like the DK in the Donkey Kong font. But for some reason, I'm assuming it's Diddy Kong because they didn't ever explicitly say it, but they showed it on there and it just says DD, which I mean, maybe it's like onomatopoeia for Diddy. It almost sounds like
Yeah.
DD, but like I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Maybe they just had to find some way to differentiate.
Yeah. The DK's taken. So.
Yeah, exactly. You can also get your picture with a pretty detailed Donkey Kong mascot. Like I was impressed by the level of detail that Donkey Kong, like I mean, the Mario, Luigi, and Peach and Toad, those mascots at Super Nintendo World, like the Mario section, are pretty like intricate and detailed. Like they blink and they have like voice lines that they'll say and everything. Like it's pretty impressive. But the Donkey Kong one is like another level. Like he looks like the size of like an actual like silverback gorilla,
Hmm.
and like very very like detailed like costuming. So I'm impressed by that.
Hmm.
I don't know if he's going to have any voice lines or anything like that. But the food that they showed included the Donkey Kong Sundae and a DK wild hot dog with
Hmm.
avocado sauce.
Hmm.
And this area's store is themed after Funky Kong's shop in the game. And then the Golden Temple that you saw when you first came in leads you past Cranky Kong and various murals as you're queuing. And there's some statues, and then you get to the end of it, and it's a minecart roller coaster. And Shigeru Miyamoto says that people should ride it even if they don't like roller coasters. So I mean, it looks pretty cool. They didn't show it, but they were like, hey, we're going to show you like a little sneak peek at the roller coaster. All they showed was the climb, and they're like, oh, that's all we can show in typical Nintendo fashion.
Yeah, that sounds very much on brand for them.
But this is the one where it reportedly hops over gaps in the track. So like in the video game, like you're on the
Hmm.
minecart levels, you're jumping. This actually has jumps in the track, and what it does is the cart actually anchors itself to the wall, and it detaches completely from the track and then comes back down. It sounds pretty cool. Like I had somebody actually kind of confirm this and like confirm the technology to me kind of on background, and it sounds impressive.
Yeah, it turns out they're pretty good at this sort of thing. I wonder, like, because is it Super Nintendo World or Super Mario World?
Super
The
Nintendo World is the overall, but this is like I guess considered like the Donkey Kong Country expansion almost.
Hmm. I just wonder how
So
Smash Brothers they intend to make it eventually. Like,
there's some
is
rumors that they might be going for Zelda next. I mean, there was
yeah.
that picture of Eiji Aonuma visiting the one in Orlando that's going to be opening next year.
Hmm.
And then there's also there's been rumors. I was actually trolling some, not trolling in the sense of like leaving bad comments, but like I was combing through a bunch of YouTube channels that like were talking about Universal Studios and like maybe their potential plans for like converting some of these kind of defunct areas of their parks, and they made a pretty compelling case for why like the Waterworld section would make a really good Legend of Zelda section of Super Nintendo World.
Hmm. Yeah, that
Um,
I just wonder like how far because Zelda is naturally like the next one you'd think of, and probably even before DK maybe. Although yeah, DK makes sense with the minecart being a roller coaster and all that. But
and also, Universal was the producer, the distributor of the Mario movie, which DK is
oh
heavily
yeah,
featured in.
yeah. Hmm. I just like could we see Metroid or like Star Fox? Like, do they get too niche eventually, or are they when do they cut it off? I wonder because, I mean, for a lot of people, like it'll be the more the merrier in a way. People like us that live and breathe video games.
Yeah, I think eventually they will get to some of those lesser known franchises, even if there's just like, okay, well, here's just like the Nintendo section of this, and maybe
Hmm.
there's like a Star Fox space ride or like a kind of like a scary or like atmospheric Metroid type section or something like that. I don't know. Like, I don't know if they'll devote entire worlds to it, but there might just be like, this is the sci-fi part of Mario of Super Nintendo World, and it's like Star Fox and Metroid, and
Hmm.
maybe then there's like another thing where there's like a Splatoon thing, but like I can't see them devoting entire worlds to that.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, Super Nintendo World's Donkey Kong Country is set to open on December 11th at Universal Studios Japan in Osaka. Then it's going to come to Universal's Epic Universe when that opens in Orlando next spring. I don't think there are any plans to put it in the one in California, which it does have a Super Nintendo World. But when I went to that one, it was pretty cramped. Not a lot of room to go
Hmm.
around in the Universal Studios in Hollywood. I mean, they don't even have the Yoshi ride that they're going to have at the other ones because there's not enough space.
Oh, weird.
So I don't anticipate them expanding it too much, or like maybe they'll do it in like a separate area, like, and then they'll maybe rebrand that one Super Mario World, this one Donkey Kong Country.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know what the play is if they're going to try to expand the California one, but I don't know how they're going to do it because there's just no real estate. They built
Jeez.
that in a pretty tight spot. But I take it you haven't had a chance to go to any of these Super Nintendo worlds yet.
I haven't. In fact, this will sound like a tragic childhood, but I've never even been to Disney World or Disneyland.
Oh wow!
I
So you're
have
not
yet.
much of an amusement park guy.
I think I would be if I went more. I don't know. I mean, the mecca of, the rite of passage of going to Disney World as a kid, that eluded us when we didn't have much money when I was a kid. But
Sure.
but now as the parent in the situation, certainly not rich, far from it. But I do think about, I have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old. Like, we don't I don't want to feel like we have to go because, like, I don't want to like drink Disney's Kool-Aid in that way, but like it probably would be rad. Like, we should figure out how to get there eventually. But yeah, uh, I mean, just as much, perhaps even more, they might enjoy a Nintendo setup. My kids love Mario. DK is my like main in anything like Smash or Mario Kart or Mario Party. I usually play as DK, so I like that he's getting his due as well.
Yeah, I mean, have you kept up with like what Epic Universe is?
Through a colleague, yes, because he's been our and I mean, not to bum people up, but he was unfortunately just laid off. But for a
Mm.
while, he was our like theme park guy, and he would go to all these things, and they'd take him on tours and show him around, and like, so he was kind of like my insight into that world. Um, yeah, I think, for me it would be like the horror one, which is a different podcast entirely. But I'd love to go to like the horror nights, or one of those that like Universal does. But I could get down with a Nintendo trip with the kids for sure.
Yeah, well, Epic Universe, for people who are listening and maybe not clued in, it's so there's like a main hub where it's just kind of like Universal. Then there are four worlds, so it's How to Train Your Dragon, Harry Potter, Dark Universe, which is all like the monster movies and everything, the traditional monster movies, like Frankenstein and Dracula and everything, Invisible Man, and Super Mario or Super Nintendo World. I feel like I'm forgetting a fifth one, but yeah, I don't know. It's
Mhm.
going to be like multiple like themed worlds, right? Like that's what Universal's Epic Universe is when it opens next year in Orlando. So seems like a pretty cool, uh, maybe worth a trip. And while you're there, hit up a couple of the Disney parks. That's not expensive at all.
Everything wants to be Fortnite now, is what I'm gathering from
It
this world.
really
It's like,
does. And Disney is investing heavily in Fortnite now and Epic Games. Oh, an Epic Universe. Look at that. It comes full circle.
yeah, I'm still waiting
Uh,
for the Fortnite movie, but that again, that's another show.
uh,
I don't want to derail us.
we're going to be talking a little bit of Fortnite later. But did you play Sea of Stars?
I don't think I ever played it. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't played it.
So this is from Sabotage Studios, the studio behind The Messenger, and it is a gorgeous turn-based RPG that came out last year. It actually ended up on our top 10 list over at Game Informer for the top 10 games of 2023. and the studio has continued developing the game. So like they've already announced that there's a paid expansion coming, and now they've released the free Dawn of the Equinox update available now for Sea of Stars, and that adds co-op play,
Hmm.
revamps the entire prologue, gives you a speedrunner mode, upgrades the combat so much so that they call it Combat 2.0, new difficulty settings, and entirely new cinematics. So does this sound like something you would finally want to check out? It's almost like a Chrono Trigger type of RPG.
Yeah, it's long been on my list of like games I know I'm unfortunately ignoring.
Yeah.
And then when I saw the co-op update the other day, I was like, it's well past time, and maybe this is what finally gets me to play it. I don't know, is it local only or is it online?
I think it's local.
Okay.
So I think that if you want to do co-op, but it also sounds like they completely improved the combat in general. So even if you
Hmm.
don't have co-op, like it sounds like this is the way to go now that it's finally out. But there is also the paid Throes of the Watchmaker DLC, which is scheduled to come out in spring of next year. So like you have a while before that hits.
Hmm.
But I mean, I guess if you really want to wait for like the definitive version of playing this game, you would wait till spring of next year. But I don't know how much the release schedule is going to calm down. I know I'm like 3 RPGs behind right now. Like I never got a chance to play much of Sea of Stars. I didn't. I made like a minor dent in Yakuza or Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. I have not. I've only made about 20 hours, only about 20 hours into Metaphor. So like I'm way behind on a lot of stuff as well. So I totally sympathize with anybody who has not played this game. I mean, myself included. But this is like the most tempted I've been to dive in since everybody was ranting and raving about it in 2023.
Hmm. Yeah,
All right.
I've only heard good things.
Yeah, so that is out now, that update. And Mark, we're going to talk about a couple of games that people have, kept up with over the years, live service games that I think we've all had our live service games that we've played and then we fall off of them one reason or another, and you kind of look at them and say, "Man, I wish we could go back to X state of this game," right? Like there
Hmm.
was always like the glory days of a game. And for some reason, 2 live service games, big ones, just decided to give us the option to go back to the quote unquote glory days. First up, Fortnite is
Hmm.
bringing back its OG map and claims it will be here to stay. So the tweet announcing it says, quote, OG is coming back and is here to stay, as I just said. Relive Battle Royale from the start and explore the OG map, collect OG loot, and relive OG seasons. Drop back in on December 6th. So there's that. And then Blizzard kicked off a 3-week event for Overwatch 2 called Overwatch Classic. This mode brings back a lot of the original game, including 6v6 gameplay, the first 21 heroes on the roster, the first 12 maps of the game, and 4 game modes, and of course, no limits to characters you can select, which means that you can choose 6 Mays if you want to, which is just a nightmare. Brings you as close to the launch status of Overwatch 1 back in 2016 as you could possibly get. They even added back the Winston opening cutscene, which is very fun to see again. That is running now and is set to go away on December 2nd. But are any of these appealing to you to jump back into these games?
Well, certainly they are, and I'll speak more to that in a moment. But man, that was like a jump scare when you said 2016. I remember listening to the GI show, probably many episodes which you were a part of, when your whole team was obsessed with that game that whole year. Like it seemed like it took over the office or something. But geez,
It
eight
did. It
years ago.
really did. It was it might have been the only time that there was a unanimous Game of the Year award.
Oh wow.
When I mean, there were some people who were like, "Oh, it's not my Game of the Year," but I get it.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
they didn't vote. Like they didn't argue against it. Like it was
Right.
even like our former editor in chief Andy McNamara came in and was like, "Hey, is there anybody who is like opposed to us giving Overwatch Game of the Year? It seems pretty obvious." And everybody was either enthusiastic about that or they were like, "Yeah, whatever."
Yeah.
Like you know, like
That's how we came to decide on Elden Ring. What was it, 2 years ago? I was like, it's not my game of the year, but I know it's like everybody else's, and I can live with
yeah, I guess
it.
that was pretty close to that as well because it was not my Game of the Year, but I get it.
Yeah,
I can live with it. I like Elden Ring just fine. It's just not my gameplay style.
yeah. But sorry, more to your original question. I don't know if you know this about me, but my enthusiasm for Fortnite is probably more than anything what got me the job I have with GameSpot today.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. So I love Fortnite. I started playing it actually only as late as Chapter 2, Season 2, which was ongoing when like the world shut down during COVID.
Hmm.
So I started playing it with my son. We were home more often. I got really into it, and about a year later, I ended up getting like a freelance role at GameSpot, and the rest, is now here I am, which is great. But yeah, since then I've obsessed over Fortnite. I get to level 200 every season, which is like the the sweatier version of completing the battle pass. You can get to 100 and get kind of everything, and then if you get to 200 you get like all these a couple other like additional bonuses. But I
Wow.
love Fortnite. I play it every day.
Can I tell you that I have played precisely 2 matches of Fortnite in my life?
Oh my god.
Though I think I was kind of the you of Overwatch 1, because I
Mhm.
put in over 1,000 hours into Overwatch 1. I used to play it, at least 2 or 3 hours every single night. So like we are kind of like the mirror version of each other in
For
this
these two,
particular
yeah,
news beat. Yeah.
that's perfect. Yeah, so I don't have like the nostalgia that a lot of people have for Chapter 1. um I guess, technically I played a little bit of it back then, but I wasn't really into it because it was kind of just trying to steal PUBG's lunch at the time, and I loved like the methodical realism of PUBG. So I just kind of like gravitated toward that, and then years later I came back to Fortnite. But so I kind of missed most of Chapter 1, and when we played through OG last year for a month, I was like, I get why this is massive. They should totally do this. It makes, business sense. It's cool for the fans, but it just wasn't really for me. And that'll probably still be true now that the mode is here to stay. Um, I often think of like Fortnite back then was like noticeably worse than it is today. But it's funny that people just like they have such a hunger for going back to that. I'm assuming the quality of life things like being back then, you couldn't sprint, you couldn't hurdle objects.
You
Um,
would imagine that they would include that stuff, but I don't know, because like it sounds like they really want to go with like that OG feeling.
yeah, it's tough because I mean, like so they mentioned like loot, for example. The OG loot was there last year, and the OG map, and it's awkward because that map is built for build mode, so there's a lot of open space because they imagined the players filling it in with like their absurd, apartment complexes that they build in 4.5 seconds. Uh, and the newer maps very much cater to like the zero build community that's almost just as popular day to day as the build mode now. So the map there's a lot more verticality, and there's a lot more obstacles. There's far fewer like just open fields that the first two chapters express a lot. So it's awkward as someone who doesn't like build mode to go back and play that old map. um, but I'll tell you what, if they all they have to do for me is pretty much like tie a few cosmetics to it, like tell me I have to do these 10 challenges and I get like a goofy emote, and I'm still gonna play it anyway, just because that's I can't help but like check all the boxes in this game.
I'm the weirdo who was excited for Save the World mode in Fortnite, which was the co-op mode. And then when they
Mhm.
came out with Battle Royale, I was like, I don't really care about that. And
Yeah.
then of course Save the World went completely away after I bought like the premium pass or whatever it was for that
Hmm.
that mode. And I was like, well, that was money that I'll never see again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, but you'll get like, because you bought this, you get like some kind of like bonus cosmetic in battle royale, and I'm like, yeah, but I don't care about that.
I was very much a fan of when everything was trying to do battle royale, and I like that a couple of them have persisted till through today and hopefully well beyond. I was actually all about that era.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, Smash Brothers would be the perfect battle royale game. Just have everybody choose one character. The screen slowly shrinks in size, because that's how you lose, is you get thrown off the screen, and then you that the last person standing is the winner. I think that would be an amazing mode if Nintendo could do more than like 8 players on a screen at a time and
Yeah.
online.
Yeah, I mean, Forza has a battle royale, so I think anybody's allowed to at this point once the racing games start doing it.
Hey, I mean, Forza rules, so
It
I'm all
does.
for that as well. But Mark, we're going to take our first break of this episode, and when we get back, you're going to give your review of Lego Horizon Adventures, and I will be sharing my thoughts on Tetris Forever. We will be right back. Coming into this week, I don't think I realized how busy it would be, but here we are, three high profile games to discuss, two of which are going to be during this main segment. Mark, you recently played through LEGO Horizon Adventures and shared your review on GameSpot.com. For those who don't recognize that name, it is pitched at least, like, kind of in theory, a LEGO retelling of Horizon Zero Dawn.
Yeah.
And though I haven't played it myself, I do love Horizon Zero Dawn so much. And for some people who maybe don't keep up with the news, over the summer, they announced that this game was coming at Summer Game Fest, not only to PlayStation, I think it's also on PC,
Mm-hmm.
but also Nintendo Switch. And, Horizon Zero Dawn is a PlayStation exclusive game within a PlayStation exclusive IP developed by a PlayStation owned studio. And, we both of the Horizon games have come to Steam, like the mainline games have come to Steam already, but I don't think people expected to see the series come to Switch next. So what was your reaction to this news over the summer?
Uh, I think it's a sign of progress, actually, because PlayStation's been a little bit slower to do this sort of thing than Xbox. I guess Nintendo they always get kind of a free pass because they're always doing their own weird stuff that sometimes doesn't even work on a different platform than their own, like back in the Wii days, for example. But yeah, generally it's a good thing when more people can play these games. And PS5s for a long time were impossible to find. Sometimes they still are, and they're very expensive. Whereas, especially with a kids game like this, if you can put that on a platform that like a lot of kids love, a lot of families love the Switch. I mean, everybody really loves the Switch, of course, but that includes a lot of kids and families. And this game in particular is just a natural fit. So I think they just saw that it makes too much sense. It'll probably make a lot of money. So why the heck not? Although it is, kind of funny that they're still seemingly petty enough to keep it off Xbox. We don't really know why they did that, but it seems like it was just they opted out of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, so this isn't the first PlayStation Studios game to come to Switch. We have had MLB The Show coming to Switch
Mm,
and Xbox for the past few years, but I think that was kind of more forced by the licensee, right? Like
yeah,
that was
yeah.
probably the MLB being like, because that news came around the time of it was like the license renewal with PlayStation and Sony San Diego. So I think that ultimately what happened there, I mean, this is not confirmed, but I think the MLB was probably like, hey, we want a multi-platform baseball game, because remember they were doing RBI baseball for a while, which was internally developed, and it was just
Very bad.
garbage.
Yeah,
It
very
was
bad.
terrible.
Yeah.
And I had high hopes for it because I would love like a retro style baseball game,
Hmm.
but that was not it at all. And there's retro mode in MLB, so it all worked out. It all came full circle. But this is the first one, as far as I know, of like a PlayStation owned IP coming to Switch. Can you think of any others? Or
Yeah, not off the top of my head. This is probably it. And maybe, maybe someone listening is screaming at their radio or wherever they're listening to this. But yeah,
I mean, the closest I can think of is like when Crash Bandicoot went multi-platform,
hmm,
because that's for a while he was like the mascot of PS1. I mean,
yeah,
obviously times have changed drastically, and that IP is owned by
Xbox now,
Activision. Well,
which
isn't
is
it
so,
owned by? Oh, it was Activision now Xbox because they bought
yeah.
Activision. You're right, yeah. Um, but yeah, and it is wild that Xbox now owns not only Crash Bandicoot but also Banjo Kazooie.
Hmm.
That's kind of crazy considering that both of those are mascot platformers from other that are closely associated with other platforms.
For a while, we were hearing maybe Sega and Xbox too. We don't hear it much lately, but a couple years ago, there was a lot of rumors about maybe Sega folding into Xbox in some way. So maybe
Well, I mean,
Sonic somewhere.
during All Things Gamers, this week we were celebrating the Halo 2 anniversary, and it's kind of crazy to be like, yeah, Bungie was so like integral to Xbox's success early on, and now the studio's owned by PlayStation.
Hmm.
So give me the kind of the elevator pitch of Lego Horizon Adventures.
It is. My main takeaway is that despite the Lego in the front of the title, it probably isn't what you might think it is if you've played, any of the 400 Lego games over the past 20 years. It's a lot like those, but it's got some pretty stark differences too. I called it a more cinematic Lego game, which makes sense when you considering what PlayStation likes to do is kind of chase Hollywood in that way with like things like The Last of Us and even like mainline Horizon. Um, yeah, it's a retelling for sure, a reimagining really of Zero Dawn. It's not exactly the same story. It's kind of kidifies it. Can I make up a word?
Yeah.
Because the main games, it deals with like corporate meddling and climate change, and it's an adult story. It's an action adventure. Not more serious than like an MCU type of thing, but it's not for kids exactly. Even just in terms of like how much detail and like lore you have to unravel. But this one, it localizes it. You're really just worried about like your community, Aloy's pals and her village, and um, so it's kind of like it's not the Horizon you think you know, and it's not the Lego game you think you know, which is actually a pretty interesting pitch. And but from that formula come like some bright spots and some blemishes as well. Bright spots, I would say it's freaking gorgeous. I don't know if you've seen screenshots of this, and I
Hmm.
should say I played my review on PlayStation. From what I've seen, it still looks really nice on Switch too. Of course, you can usually expect like Switch to dial that back a little bit, but yeah, it was made in Unreal 5, so it very much has the look of like Lego Fortnite. If anybody's ever played that, it sounds like you haven't, I guess. But uh,
I've not.
Lego Fortnite is incredibly pretty. Owed a lot to the lighting tech that engine gets to utilize, and this game seems to use the same stuff. The lumen lighting, it's freaking gorgeous, and they like the whole world is now Lego, which is interesting.
Oh,
On
okay.
other Lego games, if you remember, it'd be like, yeah, so you this playable area is basically all smashable, and then like the foreground and background is kind of like more realistic looking, like more true to life, like trees and forestry and buildings and stuff like that. Here, like they said, they very much tried to build it in such a way where like if you had the pieces, you could actually remake these levels yourself in the real world with Lego bricks, which is pretty cool. Um, but yeah, it's very linear. And sometimes that kind of hurts it a little bit, I think, because if you think of the old Lego games, I assume you've played a couple of them at least.
Oh yeah.
um, you you beat the level, but there's six other things you weren't able to do yet because you don't have the characters that have those specific skills who can solve these very particular puzzles. So you go back to it, and eventually you have 400 characters, and they come in 12 different builds, so you can take any number of several different any number of them from like several different groups and kind of like go back and 100% the levels in a way. And this one isn't really concerned with that. It's more like you play about 20 or 25 story missions. It's very A to B linear. Is a lot of combat. There's really not any puzzle solving almost. Um,
Which is interesting because that has always been a trademark of the Lego games.
yeah, yeah. That's what I mean. It is good. I mean, I gave it a 7, which on GameSpot literally translates to good. I definitely enjoyed this game. I played it with my 5-year-old daughter. She was having a blast, which for me is always a good sign. She has impeccable taste, I swear. Uh, but yeah, it's just I think it could be a blueprint for Lego games in the future, but I think they probably will want to go back a little bit and kind of reclaim some of what this game shed itself of
Mm.
in terms of like what a Lego game typically looks like. I'm fine with it not being like a collectathon, but I think it would have been a little bit more interesting if there was some cooler stuff to do after you beat the campaign. There's not much there.
So the first game, Horizon Zero Dawn, like the actual mainline game that this is based on, very self-serious, and I think you
Yeah.
pointed this out in your review that it's interesting to see these characters put in these like zany
Mhm.
situations. Can you talk a little bit about how the game handles kind of transitioning the tone so drastically and putting them in these situations like that?
Yeah, so there are traditional cutscenes that are loaded with jokes as well, but a lot of what happens in terms of advancing the story as you play are these like almost like talking head segments like you see in like The Office or something where like the screen you can kind of see your gameplay in the background, but like Aloy is, on one side of the screen taking up nearly half of it, and she's speaking to Ross on the other side, and they're doing very like Lego animations, and a lot of characters are they become kind of caricatures of themselves, in a way that I think I wrote it. It's like, if I was an actor, it seems like a very fun mission to get to like reimagine this character with whom I've become like so invested in, and who I feel like I've probably come to know as a person playing them first, through so many hours of dialogue, as someone like Ashley Birch probably has with Aloy. I mean, surely she has. So getting to remix them in that way is fun. Like Errands, if folks have played the mainline games, Errands in the main games, he's a bit of a lighter hearted character already, but they're all trying to like save the world. So again, it's very like MCU, where it's like the stakes are high, but sometimes we'll goof off a little bit. Whereas this one's like the stakes aren't nearly as high to begin with, and then like it's a kids game, so like the jokes are coming much more frequently. Aaron's like is obsessed with finding a mythical hoard of donuts, which we can, because their world like takes place long after ours is gone, we can consider that to mean like he's basically just looking for like uh, a Dunkin' Donuts somewhere that like he's heard that exists in the world. It's for kids. It's the way that I would look at like a kid's joke and think like, well, that I probably don't really laugh at that, but I think I find it charming and cute.
Hmm.
And then when my daughter's laughing at it, it's like, okay, this is clearly the intended audience here, and she's telling me they're nailing it. And yeah, like as a parent, I love games like this. Uh, it's fun. I don't want to sound down on it because I liked it. I was maybe I
Yeah.
led too much with what I think it could have done better, because it is very good. I like it.
So the puzzles doesn't sound like that's like a thing that is brought forward from the other Lego games, but two of the other really key elements in those Lego games are platforming and kind of like a rudimentary combat system.
Hmm.
How did it approach both of those?
Those, yeah, so those are definitely two of its strengths. On the combat point, if you've played the, I know you have, but if listeners have played the other games, it's very much about like finding these machine animal robot monster things, finding their weak points, inflicting damage there specifically is basically like a critical hit system where you like scan the enemy and you attack those weak points. Here they translate that very simply in a way that I found really satisfying, which is with Aloy with her bow and arrow, for example, you kind of just hold the attack button and it aims like a long arrow, so you can be quite far from the enemy and that arrow is still probably reaching the enemy, so you can see like exactly where it's going to go, um, which is helpful for like kids or inexperienced players, I think. Uh, and it basically translates from for an adult system to a kid system, like that focus based combat of like chipping away at their weak points, kind of crowd controlling, scrambling around, dodging this guy's mortars, dodging that guy's leaping attack, and just kind of like getting in your little critical hits like in those moments of respite. And I thought that was because I actually played a demo at Summer Game Fest, and that was my main takeaway. Them just in the snippet was like, oh, what a cool idea to like not lose what the combat feels like, but reinventing it in a way that kind of ignores what Lego games typically are, which is just button mashing, um, in favor of like keeping like holding on to that important aspect of Horizon. I love that part. And then similarly with the platforming, I thought they did some really nice things that kind of really speak to like an accessibility gap, I feel like, because for a lot of kids, this will probably be their first game or one of their first games like ever. Uh, and one nice thing they do is like as you approach like a narrow passageway that you have to like walk across, typically a game would ask you to like balance that. Here, you just walk across it. They're going to automatically jump on it. You really can't miss it once you approach it. The character just steps on it and you can move across it without any concerns. Same with the zip lines, like you don't have to jump on the zip line, which could inevitably result in like a kid missing their jump and falling to their death, and just all these little points that could have been like buildup of frustration, the game just erases them. It just prevents them from ever happening, which is
Oh, nice.
yeah, I thought that was very thoughtful of them.
So are there any other parts of, I mean, because I'm God, this all this has me wanting to do. Like, it doesn't have me wanting to go out and play Lego Horizon Adventures. It has me wanting to replay Horizon Zero Dawn. I just bought the remastered version of it on PS5.
I did too. After I finished this review, I was like, well, I'm gonna pay the $10 and I'm gonna upgrade my PS4 version and I'm gonna play it again.
Yeah, that was, I mean, it got me thinking back to how amazing that like 2.5 month stretch was in 2017, because you have to think about it. We got Horizon Zero Dawn, we got the Switch with Breath of the Wild, we got I think a month prior to that we had Yakuza Zero.
Hmm.
Then I think it was like 2 weeks later. I mean, Mass Effect Andromeda. Now we look back at it with a little bit of like, that wasn't as good.
Yeah.
But like the hype levels for that game were insane because that was coming off of like Mass Effect 3. And then we got Persona 5 here in the West. So like, and then Mario Kart 8 Deluxe that same month. It was like 2017 was wild, y'all. Like,
Yeah.
and Horizon Zero Dawn was one of the kind of games that kicked off that crazy stretch. And one of my games of the year, I think it was number 2 or 3 behind like Breath of the Wild and Persona 5, probably. I think it
Hmm.
was like Breath of the Wild, Persona 5, and then Horizon Zero Dawn. So I adore this. I like this. I would rate this higher than Mario Odyssey, and I host a Nintendo podcast.
Oh
That's how
wow.
much I love Horizon
Really?
Zero
Oh,
Dawn.
I
I mean,
didn't know that about you.
and Mario Odyssey is my favorite 3D Mario of all time too. Like it beat out Super Mario 64.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's not like I'm like saying it's like a huge gap, but like I would probably like say that Horizon Zero Dawn is like a game that I enjoy equally, if not more, than Super Mario Odyssey. So like I love Horizon Zero Dawn. I don't know that I really want to play a Legoized version of that. Like I think that it would give me the same sensation that I have when I go and play like Lego Star Wars: The Skywalker Saga, where I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, it's really cool that they like remade this game, like because they released this over the course of like 3 different games, where you had the prequels, you had the original trilogy, and then you had the sequel trilogy, and they just packed all that into this one property or this one bundle, and they remade it all with like modern mechanics and
Hmm.
graphics and everything. And it's really cool to have that all in one bundle. But the entire time I'm playing that, I'm like, man, I wish this wasn't Lego. Like, I wish that they had this thing, but like just like regular people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I feel like I would feel the entire time. And then I'd be like, oh wait, that exists. I can just go play Horizon Zero Dawn on a PS5.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I like as a dad, I love, and it's one of the reasons why I try to cover a lot of the family games on GameSpot is because I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of our peers in this industry don't even have kids. I think it's because typically we don't feel safe enough in our jobs to settle down in that way. But I do have 2 kids, and I love being a dad, and I think kids deserve cool stuff, you know
Oh, of course.
and
We had cool
I
stuff when we were kids. So like
yeah, yeah,
of course like our kids should have cool
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I don't mean to imply that you disagree. I'm saying for me, like sometimes kids stuff can feel like shovelware.
Yeah.
It's just like, yeah, you just slap SpongeBob on and throw it out there, they'll buy it. THQ basically folded 10 years ago or whatever
Mm.
because of that strategy. She's like, we're just going to make licensed games. They're not going to be good, but kids will recognize the characters and they'll buy them for $50. Like, no, they won't. They're playing on phones now and it's all free. uh, Again, that's a different episode. Sorry. uh, but yeah, so I very much like, I look for and I try to call out about like cool things that are for kids, or families together. And for me, like, when I'm playing this and my daughter's loving it, and I think I even put in the review, you can like change your costume. So I was dressed up as a carrot at some points, and she was a bunny rabbit,
Yeah.
or a firefighter and a pug, or a zombie. Like all these different, it does retain some of that Lego charm, and I mean, Lego kind of rules always. I think I totally see what you mean with like sometimes I'm playing the Lego version of a thing, and it's like, well, I would like to play the other thing, but but for people who are like, well, this will probably be a Christmas gift for some kids. Um, just for the parents who want to play with their kids, or for siblings who want to play together, or whatever the relationship is. Like, this is easily worth that adventure. I just think probably Sony's like, oh, and then this will onboard kids into like the Horizon world. That'll
Of
probably happen
course.
for some, yeah. But I mean, yeah,
I
you
mean,
can't.
that's why we have so many Marvel and Star Wars games. They're like, oh, let's get these kids hooked on these IP very early in their lives.
Yeah, I
And they
just
can go see like Into the Spider-Verse and be like, hey, I know that character.
yeah, yeah, I don't think we'll get Lego Last of Us, but yeah, it works for it works for us. I think some other of you spoke to like, I don't think the story universe really translates to kids, and I was like, I think it's fine. They like I said, instead of climate change, it's kind of like a big polluting monster, and a
It's
lot of
just
the main
Ferngully.
yeah a lot of the main beats are still there. They're just made for elementary school kids, and when that's done well, I think that kind of rules. So this one could have been better, but I liked it a lot.
And it kind of goes back to like a comparison that I've made where like talking about like how kids can kind of like sniff out something that's inauthentic or
Hmm.
pandering to them, where it's like, when like, I don't know how old your daughter is, but like say like an 8-year-old is like walking up and like somebody talks to them like a kid, they're like, okay, cool, like nice to meet you too. But then somebody comes up and is like, hey man, what's up? How you doing? Like talking to them like a friend and like a peer. That is like the one that the kids are drawn to, right? Like
Hmm.
they feel that sense of respect and that sense of like, I'm not talking down to you and like trying to like, baby talk for lack of a better term to
Yeah,
like, they feel respected and they feel cool and they like seeing that person because they do that. And I think that same could be said about games. It's like, yeah, I like SpongeBob, but like if there's a crappy SpongeBob game and I'm a kid, like I'm gonna be like, oh, I don't want to play a SpongeBob game right now. I'd rather play something that actually like respects me as a like functioning gamer.
yeah, and they're all gamers now too. By the way, I do the career fair at my kids' school every year, where we get to like
Hmm.
tell them about our jobs. And I'm like, well, I have a pretty cool job. I'm going to do that, and I've done it 3 years in a row now. And let me tell you, these kids love talking to me because they just only want to talk about games. That's like it's their whole life now. I mean, usually it's Roblox and Fortnite and Minecraft, but I can get down with those enough that like very much to the point you're saying. It's like, oh, he's one of us. Let's go like stand around the little kid water cooler and talk about games with this parent who's just shown up at our school today.
And it is very funny because like I feel like even just having this podcast, like it's a perfect conversation starter. I went to a an event with my partner. She was speaking at this event, and so I got to sit at like the VIP table. And it turns out that this was like an event that like had all of these like you know powerful people within the Twin Cities. So my table was literally like three of the founders of this organization, the publisher of the local newspaper here in Minneapolis, and the mayor of Minneapolis and his daughter.
Oh
That
wow.
was our table. And when they like got around, like, oh, what do you do? And I told them like, oh, yeah, I was the director of this video game magazine. Now I have a video game podcast. And they were asking about it, and they all had Nintendo stories to share, like regardless of like what their experience level was. Like, oh, I haven't gamed in like 20 years, but oh man, I loved Mike Tyson's Punch Out and stuff like that. And it was just like really cool to them all having like the bonding over, oh, I hated how you have to blow in the cartridge to get it to work. And like it is really like gaming used to be this niche thing, and now it's almost like this multi-generational unifying force. And that's kind of how I've always viewed it, because it was something that I used to connect with my family and used to connect with friends. And when I moved to a new town, because we moved a few times in childhood, the first things that I always ask would be like, "Oh, do you like video games?" And I remember like the house that we finally settled on for the longest time, I asked, like, I got introduced to my next door neighbor, and my first question was, "Do you like Sonic the Hedgehog?" And that was kind of the start of our friendship there. So it absolutely can be that kind of connecting force, which is hilarious because it's so often painted as this isolating force. But
Mhm.
like, look at the pandemic when we were all locked down, weren't able to go anywhere. What did people turn to? It was Animal Crossing New Horizons and other like social type games, because people could like hang out with their friends without actually hanging out with them.
Mhm. VR and Fortnite and yeah.
Yeah. But if you want to read Mark's full review of Lego Horizon Adventures, you can do so on GameSpot.com. Lego Horizon Adventures is available now on Switch, PlayStation, and PC. So, Mark, before we wrap up this main segment, I wanted to talk about a game I've been playing, and people are probably rolling their eyes right now because they know how much I love this studio that puts out this game. I am a Digital Eclipse fanboy at this point. I think that their work on Atari 50 is fantastic. They do the best compilations of any company. I'm ecstatic for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Rita's Rewind.
Mhm.
I think that game, if it's even a shade as good as Shredder's Revenge, which I have utmost faith in Digital Eclipse, that I think that could be something special and like a late pick for like one of the top games of the year for me.
Hmm.
But the game that I'm talking about this time is Tetris Forever, which is their latest release in their Gold Master compilation series. And this gathers a bunch of Tetris games in one collection, which, I don't know how many Tetris games I necessarily need in one collection. If you have Tetris, you pretty much have the only game that you really need in that genre. But this has, the digital or virtual like documentary that is spread out over the course of a timeline. So all the way from like, they had the two main talking heads are Alexei Pajitnov Pajitnov. Sorry, I always mispronounce his last name. And Hank Rogers. So Alexei is the creator of Tetris. Born in the Soviet Union, and Hank Rogers is the guy who basically brought it to the West and worked with Nintendo to license it to get it on Game Boy.
Hmm.
And they co-founded the Tetris company. And then the other talking head they have is Maya Rogers, who is Hank's daughter, who is now the CEO of Tetris company. Um, so basically telling the story from primary sources of how this game was created, how it was, like the origins of it, like Alexi's inspirations, and like this like basically like little board game that he liked to play with like the different not tetronymos, but like uh it was like the five-sided version of that. Like it
Mhm.
wouldn't be pentonymos, I don't think it was, but it was some other term that he used. But he was like, oh, there's so many different combinations you can do when you're fitting these pieces together. And he actually showed himself playing with this tabletop toy that he had. And that was the spark of inspiration. He started building it on his like a prototype. And then you watch him like talk about this, you watch him like talk about his prototypes, and you can see like pictures of the computer that he used and everything. And then you can play a recreation that Digital Eclipse did of that prototype that Alexei guided them on how to create, which
Hmm.
was amazing. And then you can play like the non-commercial version of the MS-DOS version of Tetris. And then Hank Rogers talks about how he went into Nintendo of America to try to pitch them on Tetris. And he learned that Hiroshi Yamauchi, the then president of Nintendo, was a big fan of Go, the like kind of
Mhm.
Japanese kind of like match four type game. And so he was also a big Go player. So he actually came in and was like, "Hey, I want to like pitch you on a Go game for NES." And he created this game, and then like Yamauchi was like, no, it's not up to our standards. And he was like, well, it's maybe not up to Nintendo standards, but could you give us permission to publish it, because it's up to my publisher standards. And he actually founded a publisher or a development studio to publish this game. And then and oddly enough, it's my initials, BPS was the name of the studio. And he published that, and you can play that version of the game on this compilation. And then from there, he talks about all these times he had with the Nintendo president Yamauchi, and like how he would just show up at Nintendo sometimes, and they would just like sit privately in a room playing Go with each other. And apparently Yamauchi was like a master. Like they actually have like, I think they have like black belts that they award to like Go players, and he was like one of the highest degree black belts that you can be in this
Hmm.
this board game. Um, so from there, like you hear about all like the steps of the way of how like Hank Rogers went over to the Soviet Union, which was like unheard of back then because it was in the height of the Cold War, and like basically like negotiated with the government to allow them to like license Tetris. If you've ever seen the Tetris movie, it's very good. I very much recommend it. It's on Apple TV Plus, and then, if you're watching Ted Lasso or something like that, like watch the Tetris movie as well. Maybe, or if you haven't had it, like, watch, like, get like a month free trial wherever they offer, and watch the entirety of Ted Lasso and watch the Tetris movie. And then I've heard Shrinking with Jason Segel and Harrison Ford is also very
Severance
good.
is good.
Oh, Severance, yeah, and that has season 2 coming. Okay, but besides the point. The Tetris movie is very good. Alexi, when I met him back in June, he did tell me that well, his quote to me, and I said this on a recent episode. So I went to the Tetris 40th anniversary party. It was like this like kind of VIP party, and it had Hank Rogers, it had Alexei Pajitnov there. So I finally got to meet both of them. It was also where I met Nolan Bushnell for the first time, which was really cool.
Hmm.
And I was talking to Alexi just briefly, and he was like, "Oh, what did you first play Tetris on?" I told him NES, and he's like, "Oh, I love that version." And then he's like, "Have you seen the Tetris movie?" And I said, "Yes, I have. I loved it." And he was like, "It's quite faithful, aside from all the Hollywood bullshit." And and I was like, "All right, I don't know what to make of that. Like, what were you referring to?" But it I mean, it does basically follow the story of Tetris as told in this documentary that they have. And not only that, it's an interactive museum. You can go throughout like the history of Tetris. You can follow along the timeline. You can just jump to the games themselves if you don't really care about the history of it. But I think that the history is like the main thing to come for with this, because it is so cool to hear them talking about all this stuff.
Yeah, I wish kind of more games did that. Actually, we're kind of losing a lot of games from that age, and even more recent games sometimes. It'd be nice to kind of build these virtual museums more often.
Well, that's what
That's
Digital Eclipse is being really good about. They started it. I mean, they were the people who did like the first Mega Man Legacy collection, and then from
mm,
there, Capcom started doing it internally. But they did the TMNT Cowabunga collection, so like they had experience. They did the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Arcade collection, so they had all this experience of like gathering assets. But then with Atari 50, they really were like, hey, we want to do something really special with this. And that was the first time they brought in like all these industry luminaries. They brought in like all these developers of these like classic Atari games. And they had it so that they were, actually creating this interactive museum. And that became their new trademark, right? They did the making of Karateka, where they actually had it so that you could go through and play Karateka in different forms of development, right? Like it was like you could play prototypes of this game as it was being developed. And then they did Lamasoft, the Jeff Minter story, where you could play different things that he's done. Um, and then, Tetris Forever, I think, is very much in the vein of Atari 50, which it's far and away the greatest compilation ever created. And this is following in those lines. It's not as diverse as Atari 50 was,
mhm.
because I think there's something like 75 games on there that are all different genres. But one of the things that Atari 50 did was they actually allowed Digital Eclipse to make their own Atari game and include it, and it like combined different like Atari games into like it'd start off with, it was like almost like Lunar Lander, and you had to like land on like this platform, and then once you're on the ground, you're like zooming through like this 3D like vector section through like a city, and you have to like survive that. And then it's Missile Command, you got to blast up and
Hmm.
so this game also does that a little bit. So like I said, it has like Tetris on Apple II, Tetris on Famicom, and then it starts expanding out to like the other Tetris style games like Hatris, Tetris 2 plus Bomb Bliss, and all the Tetris Battle Gaiden, which was a pretty cool little
Jeez,
experiment.
some of these I've never even heard of.
But then at the very end, they let Digital Eclipse create their own Tetris like fusion game called Tetris Time Warp, and it starts off and it's like the modern version of Tetris. So like you're just playing like whatever the most recent version of Tetris is, essentially, with like modern colors and graphics and everything. And then every once in a while, like kind of like a distorted piece will show up, and if you eliminate a line with that distorted piece in it, it will warp you back to whatever era that piece was from. So
Hmm.
like if it looked like from like the original prototype that Alexi created back in the 80s, it will warp you back to a screen that looks like that. And you have to complete like almost side objectives, like, you know, clear 4 lines before this 20-second timer runs out. And if you do that, then it takes you to the next challenge and you can get more and more points. And if you don't, it takes you right back to like the modern Tetris again. And then you have to wait for the next distorted piece to come back.
Hmm.
It's almost like kind of like WarioWare-ish in that regard. But not as chaotic. It's just like suddenly like, okay, well now we're in the NES version or we're playing Bombless and now you have to clear out these bombs before the time expires. And it's very creative. And I'm completely wowed by the capabilities of Digital Eclipse to continue putting out these incredible interactive museums.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and Tetris too, like you said, they kind of go above and beyond in some ways with this one. And it feels right because you could use different like superlatives, different adjectives, but often it's regarded as the best game ever or the most iconic or the most important even. Like you can look at it in a few different like lights, but like so much of, how we've spent our free time, how we've spent our work time, how so many other people have done those same things, like it all kind of just goes back to Tetris. So it feels really nice that such a thing can exist. And yeah, you're right. It should happen more often.
Yeah, and I mean they said outright that like their dream compilation would be doing something with Nintendo, and I
Mm,
would lose my mind. I just don't see Nintendo allowing an external company to do that type of thing. Like,
yeah.
but could you imagine like a Mario thing where they're allowed to like play like different prototype versions of Super Mario Brothers? Like, I don't think there's any chance that'll ever happen. I think the closest they would ever get would be like doing like a Sonic compilation in that regard. But then we just got
Mm,
Sonic Origins not too long ago, which was kind of the collection of that. But it would be amazing if they could figure out some way to get like these giant IP. Like, I mean, obviously Tetris is a huge IP, but like these massive, like enduring IPs like Sonic or Mario or Zelda or something like that involved in like this like compilation museum style thing.
yeah. Maybe as they continue to build out their own legacy as a studio doing this and kind of seemingly nailing it each time, like that earns them more trust, in subsequent tries. So, yeah, maybe Nintendo's the white whale that they'll never quite catch, but
Yeah. I almost wish they could have done it when, I mean, this was early on. It's easy to look back and be like, oh, they should have done it with this. But like when they did the TMNT Cowabunga collection, or when we did like the Street Fighter 30th anniversary, because that was them. It would have been amazing if they did like the museum approach for that. Like I wonder if they could almost like remaster their their compilations and add those museum elements. But
mm.
that's probably quite wishful thinking. But if this sounds up your alley, and I mean, there's also like other stuff, like there's footage that Hank Rogers took when he was over in the Soviet Union, because basically he was like, I don't think anybody's going to believe what I'm seeing over here. So I'm going to record everything. And then like, in case something happens to me, like there will be like video evidence that like I was just over here, like doing business. And
Oh my god.
um, so it's very cool to see that stuff as well. But it's out now on Switch and every other major platform. I did not review it because I don't have an outlet currently. But the Switch version currently has an 89 on Metacritic, and the other versions have an 83. I would probably land somewhere in there, like between like an 8.25 and an 8.5 if I was lined up for a review, or if like Game Informer was still around. But yeah, does this sound something you would want to play or check out? Are you a Tetris fan?
I mean, I am in the sense that like I feel like everybody is just a Tetris. It's one of those few games that like it would be hard to not enjoy it. And that's partly why it's so timeless. This project in particular is, I guess, both daunting and you know exciting in a way because I'm a fan, but I don't feel like I'm a Tetris historian at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think my first one was probably Game Boy. I would dip
A
into
lot of
different
people.
ones since then, here and there. And then I think the one I probably spent the most time on was like Tetris. Was it Tetris Connected? Like the very
Uh,
musical
yeah, Tetris Effect.
Tetris Effect. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they did like the Connected update or whatever. Yeah, I like that one a lot just because I always love like rhythm games. So that was the one that kind of spoke to me the most.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, Tetris is just one of those. Again, talking about rites of passage earlier with like Disneyland and stuff. Like you can't really grow up in games without like Tetris being in there somewhere. Or I don't know, maybe now you can, maybe if my son or daughter follows my footsteps, maybe I guess they haven't played much Tetris. Maybe that's my bad, but yeah, it's just for us, for folks around our age and older and some younger too. It's freaking Tetris, man.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Like,
that those are the things that make this not quite as good as like the Atari 50 compilation is like
mm,
once you play a few of these versions of Tetris, like in this collection, it's like, okay, I get it, right?
mm-hmm,
Like you don't have to play like it's like, all right, I've played like 6 different versions of Tetris. I don't need to play like also like, okay, here's the Sega Genesis version. Like I'm glad it's there, but like at a certain point, I was just like, all right, I get it. I understand
yeah,
what I'm playing here, and also there are some missing entries that are, they talk about the Game Boy version and how important that was, but the Game Boy version of Tetris is not in this compilation.
mm,
And I think the reason for that is it's on Nintendo Switch Online, which means that Nintendo is probably like, nope, we're not going to let you do that, even though so much of the documentary is referencing the Game Boy version of Tetris. It's kind of weird to see that not there. Um, it is included in Tetris Time Warp, like when you can get warped back to the Game Boy era, but there's not like the full version of
mm,
the Game Boy version of Tetris. So that's really like those are the two knocks that make it so it's not quite as high up, because it's always going to be that way when it's like kind of a not rudimentary, but like that's the charm of Tetris, right? It's a very simple game. So when you have like, double digits versions of kind of the same game with a few different gameplay aspects, eventually you're going to be like, all right, I understand what I'm seeing here. Like I don't need to necessarily play every single version of this, even though I'm glad from like a completionist perspective that a lot of these versions are on here, but then the ones that I really care about are not on there. So
yeah.
it's a little frustrating in that regard, but still, like I said, 8.25 or 8.5 would be what I probably would have landed on if I were reviewing this game.
Mhm.
But Mark, we're going to swap you out for the final segment, but do you have anything to plug or say before we part ways here?
Hmm. Uh, like you, I'm over on Blue Sky now, which we're all seemingly migrating to, which is nice. It's the vibes there are totally cool, way cooler than the other place that I'm not even going to name anymore. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I as an editor, I think I am expected to edit a lot, but I actually end up writing a lot as well. And a lot of that I kind of just put on my own plate. So you can always read me like writing new things. I'm publishing something soon that will annoy folks.
Oh, good.
It's on one of my hobby horse subjects that I'll only tease here, but you can look for me on Blue Sky or just go right to GameSpot.com and my name will be probably on the front page somewhere. So
Well, thank you so much for joining me. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll be joined by another guest as we dive into Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake. We will be right back. We are back, and my next guest has been spending a lot of time in another highly long anticipated game for Switch. We first learned about Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake in 2021, but we didn't get to see it in action until this past summer. Now the game's available for everyone, and we are going to dive a bit into how this gorgeous remake turned out. Joining me to give her thoughts is the co-host of the awesome Axe of the Blood God RPG podcast. It's Nadia Oxford. Nadia, how
Oh,
are you doing?
oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. You flatter us so very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I was happy to be able to make my debut on Axe of the Blood God a few weeks ago.
That's
Or
right.
I guess it was maybe even a little bit longer than maybe it was a couple months ago at this point. But was happy to make my appearance on there. I've always had a great relationship with so
We're
many people on that podcast.
always happy to have you.
Yeah, well, now I'm happy to have you.
Yeah.
And as such, we are going to do the tradition that we have for the second time this episode. We already did it with GameSpot's Mark Delaney at the start of this show.
Oh, yeah.
And now we're going to have you do this. It's a tradition anytime anybody makes their debut on All Things Nintendo, get to know them through the lens of their history with the company. So, first Nintendo game, favorite Nintendo game. The first Nintendo game, you can interpret it a little bit loose. It could be your first video game you ever played, like on a Nintendo console. It can be your first Nintendo game, your first Nintendo memory. However you want to go about that, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, first of all, when you say tradition, I just think tradition. And yeah, traditions are very important. So I will say that my history with the Nintendo goes back to like the 80s, where I first saw it at a friend's house. She was having a birthday party, and her mom was playing it because her mom was cool. You know, it was the 80s, sitting there smoking, playing Nintendo as you did back in the day. And I was just fascinated because, yeah, it wasn't my first video game. My first video game was like Donkey Kong on the ColecoVision. I played a lot of Atari, and I liked games, but they weren't like, they didn't grab me because I wasn't really thrilled about, you know, counting up a high score or something like that. So when I saw this game where this plumber man was, you know, actually running across levels with beginnings and ends and a story, as it were, it had a beginning and an end. It was like, oh my god, this is an interactive storybook. And I was always kind of a real like monster about stories and reading and stuff like that. So to me, it was just another form of taking in fantasy stories, and I was just like so thrilled to finally be part of the Nintendo crew when I actually got one, which took a while, but I got there.
Well, it sounds like your first Nintendo game was actually Donkey Kong Coleco, because that was
Yes.
published by Nintendo and developed by Nintendo. So
I did get a little bit confused when I was a little bit older, and I kind of knew how copyrights worked. And I went back to ColecoVision and saw Nintendo on as a name on there. I'm like, that's not right. And eventually, you learn a little bit more about the law. But yeah, when you're a kid, it's a little bit confusing.
yeah, but that's a great start to I mean, a hobby that you have kept up with to this day very clearly,
Yes.
and parlayed it into a job. So there you go. Can't
Yes.
really complain about that. And then that brings us to the second part of the question, which is, what is your favorite Nintendo game of all time?
That is so hard. I know you probably hear that all the time, but I'm probably going to just give it to Final Fantasy VI, or do I have to say like a Nintendo first party
No,
game?
it's
It could
whatever you
be
want to go
okay.
with.
So I'm going with Final Fantasy VI. I played that on the SNES around this time of year, actually, back in
Hmm.
1994. It's a game that really kind of shaped me as a writer. I mean, there's a few games that did that, but Final Fantasy VI was a major one because the way I describe it is it was the first game to treat me like an adult. And
Hmm.
I think that's a good way to describe it. It's just, I was kind of at that age where, oh my God, I was really into like serious stories and, you know, soap operas and drama. And so it all kind of matched up really nicely. It lined up with my life.
Hey, that's a great entry. I mean, it was known as Final Fantasy III over in the
Of course,
States,
yeah.
so, but now, I mean, I think pretty much everybody has retconned that title, and it's just Final Fantasy VI at this point. Like, we've gone with the global title.
Yeah, yeah. You're gonna hear Final Fantasy 3 maybe if you're in a RetroCon on the floor. That's when you'll hear it, but now you don't really hear it very much anymore otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, especially now that we have like the pixel remasters on
Yes.
Switch, and it's not called Final Fantasy III anywhere, as far as I'm aware. I
No,
mean,
that's totally retconned. It's interesting that some
on the
things.
NES or SNES Mini, maybe I think it is.
Yes, the SNES. You're right. The SNES Mini. They didn't alter anything there, but it's actually funny how I actually wrote an article for US Gamer because I used to work for them. They shut down, RIP,
Hmm.
about Final Fantasy VI and the localizer of that game, Ted Woolsey, who really treated the game with reverence when he translated it because he realized it was actually a very special story. And he did have some mistranslations. Like, for example, he called the octopus monster Ultros, Ultros, and it was supposed to be Orthos.
Hmm.
So that mistranslation, however, really stuck. To this day,
It did.
Ultros is Ultros. Like even Final Fantasy 14, the server named after Ultros is Ultros. So yeah, I actually told him that, and he was quite amused by it. So sometimes mistranslations just stick like that.
I love those stories like that as well. I mean, the very famous one is like Eris or Aerith.
Aerith, yep, mine was
Uh,
Eris, so I had to drop that habit.
that has also been completely retconned. So yeah, there's been a lot
Yes,
of that in the Final Fantasy realm, we'll say.
and
But
in Dragon Quest, which we'll be talking about today. So there you
perfect
go.
segue. There you
There you
go. It's
are.
almost like
Yeah.
you're on a podcast yourself.
Nah. I heard some jerk podcast called Axe the Blood God, but I hear a bunch of jerks. But
So
yeah, you want me to talk about HD2D and all the good
yeah,
stuff that came with it? Well, basically, I've
so,
been a Dragon Quest 3 fan since I was a little girl. I played the original Dragon Warrior 3 on the NES, and yeah, so it's a very special game to me because like Final Fantasy 6, it was one of those games that kind of taught me how a game could have a story and could have like a narrative to follow, and that is something Dragon Quest 3 does very masterfully, and that's reflected in the remake as well. Because even though the remake has a lot of, it looks beautiful, it has a lot of quality of life improvements, has some extra content, has you can bash up monsters if you want, make them fight each other for your draw blood for your amusement. The core of Dragon Quest III has always been very, very, very solid. You, of course, know by now that the game is basically a religion in Japan. The It's not even an urban myth; it's true. People lined up for hours outside, and the government said no more Dragon Quest on weekdays or whatever it was, because everyone was skipping school and work, which is a good call. Always skip school and work for Dragon Quest, kids. It's the more you know. But yeah, the core loop of Dragon Quest III is very interesting because, first of all, you have the evolved job system, which was a really huge step up from Final Fantasy at the time. That is still in the game. It hasn't been altered very much in the remake. It doesn't really need to be altered because it's a pretty solid system on its own. It's just kind of basic, which I think some people criticize it for. But I think it's really nice. I think they did a great job taking what's simple but solid and good about Dragon Quest III and giving it like those beautiful graphics, those beautiful like upgrades. But ultimately, it's really struck me as I've played this game how Dragon Quest III is very much like the world of Ruin from Final Fantasy VI, albeit far less depressing. There comes a point in the game where you get your ship, let's say that's about one third into the game, and you're told, okay, well, if you want to have a chance against this bad guy, Baramos, you need to hatch this legendary phoenix. And to do that, you have to find, I think it's 8 or 7 orbs that are scattered around the realm. Now, you can find hints in the remake, but otherwise, you are very much on your own to explore the world, which is, I don't even know if it's a spoiler to say it's our world. So you are going to these landmarks that you're familiar with on Earth. Things like there's literally a man in quote unquote New York who's like, I want to build a town here. And you have to bring him a merchant, and you have to bring him you have to just kind of go through all the stuff with him. And as you go through the stuff with him, the American Revolution pans out, or at least a tiny little snippet of it, because this is like a little tiny Nintendo game. There's a revolution, and this guy ends up in jail, and these people are like, we are the government now, and just stuff like that happens like all over. It's a very cleverly written game. It always has been, and yeah, and even once you get those orbs, there's quite a bit more going on. One of my mistakes when playing the remake was thinking, oh, it's a short game, and it is compared to like Metaphor, which I just finished, which by God took me 100 hours, and I loved every hour of it. But anyway, I'm playing it now, and I have been playing it for a while, and I'm realizing, oh yeah, this game is actually far more intensive than I thought, and it's not like they added a whole lot into the game to pad it out. It's just a very beefy boy on its own, and I'm really glad that people are generally, like what I can see from the meta scores, people are generally quite enthralled with it. Not just old people like me who've played the original, but also people who maybe never played Dragon Quest before, Dragon Quest 3, or at least not the old ones. Like, of course, Dragon Quest 11 was a huge hit. I think that makes a lot of people eager to check this out. So I really hope that they like what they see. And that was me rambling. Thank you for enduring that.
No, absolutely. And for people who aren't aware, so they may have heard that Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D Remake is coming out before Dragon Quest 1 and 2
Yes.
HD 2D Remake. And the reason for that is this is actually narratively the first game in that trilogy. So this story actually happens before 1 and 2, so it makes sense in terms of like the story chronology that you would play 3 before 1 and 2 come out.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something, or you referred to it a little bit, that there is some new content here. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things they added was the monster arena, which kind of goes hand in hand with the new class, which is the monster tamer, or beast tamer, something like that. Yeah, the original Dragon Quest 3 had a gambling arena where you could bet on monsters, and that was a lot of fun to cheese, because like if you were playing it on an emulator, gasp, back in the day, you could just like load states and get 1 billion like gold by the time you're like level 20. But what they did here was there are monsters scattered around the world, and when you talk to them, they will join you, and they will. I was kind of hoping they'd fight with you in your party, but what they do is they go to the arenas all over the world and just kind of hang out there. And when you're ready, you go to the arenas, you register your party, and you fight your monsters with the monsters in the arena. I think it's similar to, was it Dragon Quest 8, I think, that had a monster arena, and it's a little bit like that. But these sprites they have of the monsters are just absolutely gorgeous. I am so impressed with how well animated they are, how well drawn they are. They're just really, really lovingly done, especially like in this year we lost the great Akira
Hmm.
Toriyama, who was the character designer for Dragon Quest monsters and characters alike. And he, like, to me, Toriyama he will always be the king of monster designers. That man never needed an excuse to draw a dragon, and I appreciate any man who is like that. So I think this remake is a really, let's just say it won't piss Japan off, because Japan is very, very careful about its canon with Dragon Quest, and it can be very sacred. But yeah, this is a wonderful remake that really kind of strikes the balance between, making that new content. I haven't really opened up all the new content yet. I know there are some new cinemas actually that feature the hero's father, who, according to game lore, went ahead of you to go
Hmm.
slay the beast that was terrorizing the world. He didn't do so good, I suppose. So everyone's like, "Hey, you're 16 now. Guess what? How do you feel about quests?
Get on out there.
Get on out there." So yeah,
At least
that's
it's not like 10 when they send you out on a Pokemon quest.
no, 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 no. At least they waited. They gave you a sword. At least in Pokemon, they don't give you a sword. They give
Like,
you a
here's some
rat.
balls that you can put some monsters in. Like,
Yeah,
there's a monster tamer
exactly.
class, but that's the entirety of Pokemon is the monster tamer class.
You're right. Yeah, it absolutely is. And in Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D, yes, you have the Monster Tamer class, which basically, these attacks that the Monster Tamer has are kind of familiar, like Fire Breath, certain kind of strike attacks that they were kind of always given to other classes in other Dragon Quest games. So you will recognize a lot of these moves, but some of them are weird too. Like there's one called Groom, which is like HP healing. So it'll say, like, I named my monster tamer Ayla, so it'll say like Ayla Grooms Goten, which is what I named my hero, and it just sounds really weird in my head, and it looks really weird on the screen, but whatever. And I think the more monsters you collect as to fight with you, that will give you more power as a monster tamer, but I'm not 100% sure how that works just yet. But I do like the monster tamer class because, like the thief class, they can wield whips and boomerangs, which are good, like, spread out damage dealers.
Mm. And from what I have played, combat is extremely old school. So it is something that
Yes.
people should go into with open eyes, right? Like, it's not like, oh, this is like going to be like even Final Fantasy X level of combat. Like, this is like way back early NES day combat that you are going to be getting yourself acquainted with over the course of this adventure. So I really think we should give people an overview of how combat works, because it is probably quite different from anything that like a modern RPG
Yeah.
player is going to be used to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially, again, it came off the soft metaphor, which is also a turn-based game, but it's a very modern turn-based game. It has the press
Hmm.
turn system, which is really excellent. I can't speak enough about how great that battle system is. Dragon Quest III is a lot simpler. You're right. You're looking at fight, magic, item, run, defend. And to be fair, Dragon Quest is always usually revolves around those basic commands. You're always looking at a more basic kind of turn-based system than what you'd get from like Shin Megami Tensei or Final Fantasy, whatever weird thing they're trying at the time. So yeah, that is definitely something you should know if you're going into the game. But that also is kind of nice because it simplifies things. And again, if you're kind of coming down from a complicated game or RPG, sometimes you just want a basic turn-based, as I said, fight, magic, item, run game. And this is like one of the best released this year. This is the most basic ass RPG and the prettiest wrapping you can conceive of, and it works so well. So I would absolutely recommend it if you just want something that's a little calmer. I think it'd be great, like, as a, say, a fireside game. I'm playing it on the Switch. Some people
Mm.
have noticed performance issues with the Switch. I've been playing handheld, no major issues, but of course, I'm sure that the PlayStation 5 version looks better. Probably moves at 60 frames per second.
The PS5 version is absolutely gorgeous. I can vouch for that. It does run, I believe, at 60 frames per second. There's no stuttering at all as you go from like screen to screen and explore the
Yeah.
world. Can you talk a little bit to the dungeons and the progression that you experienced through that, and like how, I guess, modern versus old school that can feel, even though this is a remake?
Actually, it's very interesting. It's something I noticed, and I mentioned this on our show last week. We were talking about tutorial islands, quote unquote. That is, games,
Mm.
specifically RPGs, that get you used to things like, say, I forget the name of the area in Elden Ring, but you have that very basic area where you have some schmucks where you can beat up and you learn like the mechanics. There's something I haven't played Witcher 3, gasp, but
Whoa.
Kat mentions the White Orchard and how that's kind of an area. I do have it on my to-do list, trust me. Um,
I mean, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are notorious for that as
exactly.
well. Like, it's very clearly defined what the tutorial islands are there.
Especially the first one.
Breath of the Wild with
Breath
the
of the
Great
Wild, yeah, thank you.
Plateau.
The Great Plateau, exactly. So that's what we're talking about here. And Dragon Quest III has its own kind of tutorial island, which quite literally, when you get your quest from the king, the first thing you're supposed to do is find the thief's key, which is a very basic key. And to do that, you have to get to a tower. But the tower is on an island. So how do you get to that island? Well, there's at least 2 tunnels on the first like island you start off on. Actually, it's interesting. Again, this is based on our map of the world, but the continent you start the game on doesn't exist in our world. It could be a reference to Mu,
Hmm.
the lost continent. So you start on that continent, and you have, I think, 2 at least underground tunnels to go into to get to this tower. And people give you hints about this and say, oh, I've heard that there's this hole that goes blah, 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 or, I hear the key is in blah, blah, blah. And it basically leaves you to discover those tunnels and to work through them and to arm yourself thusly and then to climb the tower and then to find the key, which is with an old man who's like, oh, hey, there you are. I was told in a dream to give you this key. There you go. So that is your first quest. And of course, there aren't a lot of enemies that are going to overwhelm you. One great rule that was established in the first Dragon Quest and still carries over to most RPGs this day is when you cross bridges, that's when you expect trouble. That's when the enemies get harder. So to this day, for almost any RPG, if you cross a bridge, you better watch your ass. And this is the case here, too.
Yeah, I guess that is true.
Yep, it's true. And this is the case here, too, where the island starts off like, oh, you have like basic bunny rabbits and crows that you can beat up. Slimes, of course. Slimes are always there.
Of course.
You go underground to on the way to this tower, and your enemies are a little harder. I think you might find mages and bugs and stuff like that. And then you get to the tower, and then the enemies like ramp up a little bit more. You also have an inn though, which is really funny because if you go to an inn, that's how you heal. So you go to this inn that's in the tower, and this man running the inn is like, I am so broke, no one's coming to this inn. It's like, dude,
Relatable.
I don't know what you expected, but here I am. And he's like, oh my God, thank God, a patron. So if you do need help, there's your leg up. You can have the inn to kind of heal yourself. It's very cheap. It's very easy to get to. And yeah, that is your first quote unquote tutorial. And then your game starts for real because you use that key to unlock the warp portal that takes you to Romala.
Okay.
I don't know if they call it. I can't remember what they call it in the game. Yeah, so I was just very impressed with how modern that all feels. And even though it does feel modern, it is not changed from the original game. So I don't think people who are like, oh my God, an old game are going to be too shocked to find it. It goes down very easy. It still goes down very easy.
It's just very interesting that Square Enix is the same company that's putting out Final Fantasy VII Remake, and they call this Remake as well, but it is a completely different scope and scale and mission statement that they have with this type of remake as they do with Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's like, what if we just made Final Fantasy VII like today instead of like just like making everything pretty and like kind of modernizing a few things here and there. Like, this is a remake from the ground up, as the name indicates, but it's much more loyal to the source material than something like Final Fantasy VII, which we don't even know if the story is canon in Final Fantasy VII at this point, because it's just like the weirdest stuff imaginable happening. And it's like to the point where it's like we get to the third part of Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, and it's like, I have no idea what's going to happen at this point, even though I know how the story goes.
Pretty much, yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like if you know the story of Dragon Quest III, you pretty much know how this pans out.
Yes, more or less. There are the extra bits that I mentioned. I haven't seen all of them yet. But I've always felt that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest diverged like so long ago. The like evolutionary tree split. And what you have with Final Fantasy is it's kind of this wild specimen that Squaresoft is always trying new things on. And yes, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is an excellent example of that, which I love. I adore it. But like you, I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't care. Whereas Dragon Quest III, much humbler, much more dependable, steady, sturdy RPG series. Some people in the West don't like that as much because it is that basic. There are random encounters. There is that the menu based stuff, as I mentioned before, but it's dependable. I am reliving the story, and yet it's so much fun to go through it in this like new environment because it's like, oh, I know the story beats, but I don't know what's coming at the same time. I don't know how they're going to present this because there are more story scenes, not a whole lot, but there is like voice acting and stuff like that. So they made sure to kind of like, you go into a town, for example, and it pans over the town and you get like, the name of the town. And of course, that's not something you got in Dragon Quest III, the original one. What they did here that is so impressive is that Dragon Quest III, despite being, such a simple looking game on the NES, the caves and dungeons and whatnot, most of them had a personality, whether through like the color of the tiles, the style of, sometimes they'd have like statues in there to kind of decorate the place, even the types of enemies. And they've taken those ideas, those colors, and made structures out of them, if you know what I mean. Like they've kind of molded dungeons around these very basic tiles and given them 3D personality. And it's really good. Like some of the like, say like you saw some cheesy dragon sprite that was there to decorate the tower. Now it's a dragon statue. You know what I mean? Like a really nice looking, really beautifully rendered dragon statue.
Yeah, it is an absolutely gorgeous game. Again, I've only played a few hours of it, so I'm barely scratching the surface. But how would you, to kind of wrap up this conversation, how would you recommend this to people who are listening to this and maybe don't have any history with Dragon Quest III, but are curious about the franchise? Is this, do you think, a good jumping on point for the franchise, or should they maybe look at like Dragon Quest XI, which is also on Switch, to kind of get their start here?
It really depends what you want. Dragon Quest XI is a fully, like, it's a 3D game, fully intensive, like 100-hour plus RPG, probably more. It's very, very long. You do have to dedicate a lot of time to it. It's a brilliant game. I absolutely love it. But if you want a calmer entry point into like what the history of Dragon Quest is all about, 3 is definitely an easy recommendation. If you want a more bombastic 3D RPG that you want to kind of stay with for hours, Dragon Quest XI is a great entry point. Kind of like Ys, where you have the top-down games and then you have the 3D games, and they both have their pluses and minuses, and their strengths and their weaknesses. But yeah, that's what you're looking at basically here. You can't go wrong with Dragon Quest, except 7. People have opinions about 7.
What's your opinion on 7?
Honestly, I didn't think the 3DS remake was that bad. It's not my favorite Dragon Quest 7. It's not my favorite Dragon Quest. I probably won't play it again, but it was cool. It existed. I'm glad.
Well, Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake is out now on Switch and pretty much every other major platform. But for those who are wondering what is on the other side of the fence and the $10 Patreon tier on all things Nintendo, over on All Things Gamers this week, I was joined by my former coworker, Game Informer's last editor-in-chief, Matt Miller, as we celebrated the 20th anniversary of Halo 2. It's a game that is near and dear to both of our hearts, so it was great to get together with someone I worked with for a decade and consider a very good friend to discuss Halo 2's development, impact, and legacy. Again, you can find that episode as well as every other episode of All Things Gamers on the All Things Nintendo Patreon's $10 tier. But that wraps up this episode of All Things Nintendo. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me for this final segment.
Oh, thank you. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I always ramble when it comes to Dragon Quest.
You were fantastic. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. As you know, the Patreon and the associated Discord server are the best ways to get any questions or comments in. You can also get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com. Hit me up on social media, particularly Blue Sky, at Brian P. Shea. That is also my YouTube channel name, and if you would subscribe to that, it would help me out a lot. Nadia, where can people find you online?
Well, basically, I've kind of abandoned Twitter altogether. I am on Blue Sky at Nadia Oxford. Of course, I'm also on Axe the Blood God, as you have mentioned. We cover RPGs, old and new, Eastern and Western. We have a live show every Saturday at, let me see here, 9 a.m. PT, 12 p.m. ET. And yeah, that's on twitch.tv/bloodgodpod. And of course, you can support us at patreon.com/bloodgodpod. We really would love your support. We love what we do. We're independent, and we're having a good time, and we'd love to have you there.
I can't recommend Axe of the Blood God more. It's a fantastic RPG-based podcast, and
Thank you.
You will hear plenty of other RPG opinions from people like Nadia. And but thank you so much. That is our show for this week. Take care. We'll see you next time. Before we wrap up this episode of All Things Nintendo, I just want to give a special shout out to the $10 patrons of the All Things Nintendo podcast. Aaron Smith, Abdullah, Adam Scott, Elena R., Alec Acanino, Alex Stadnick, Andy Junkins, Ben Richland, Chain Whippin, Chaps My Ass, Chris Callie, Colton Bredlau, Dan Norman, Derek Sigmund, Dusty Beeman, Ian T. Clark, Jackal, Jason Thompson, Jawar Hello, Jill Grote, Johnny Five, Jordan Sloat, Jose Villalobos, Joseph Jury, Joshua DeProy, Justin Childress, Cody Gibson, Creeper 207, Light Pole, Mad Genie Confused Koala, Marshall Thompson, Megan S, Nintendo 101, Pat Roberts, Paul at Drunk on Mako, Philip Aleva Cox, Pratable, Rob McCann, Roger Reichart, Russell Sayer, Scott Matthews, Sir Phobos, Smithy Poo, Tux DC, Wham Bam Sam the Gaming Man, Zach Marcus, Zachary Pliggy, and Zek 3 Sword Sama. Thank you again so much for supporting this show. It really means a lot.